Shabbat Shalom. We turn this week to the second parasha in the book of Deuteronomy, Ve'et Hanan. And it's important to pause for a moment to consider the Latin word for the fifth book of Torah, Deuteronomy. It means the second law or the second telling. So, why so? We have the voice of Moses in this fifth book retelling much of what we've already read in the books of Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. Now, in his own words, Moses is a model for us and for Jews throughout the ages about the importance of interpreting words of Torah and retelling the story in our own words. So what happens when we do this, when we retell a story in our own words? Well, as we learn from Moses, the words are not exactly the same. And we witness this, we hear this, in the most profound way in this week's Torah portion. The narrator sets it up by saying, V'zot haTorah asher sam Moshe lifnei b'nei Yisrael. This is the Torah that Moses set before the Israelites. And then Moses proceeds to go through the Ten Commandments, surely familiar to all of us. I'm actually sure that Molly and Zach could give us all 10 of those commandments. But I won't list them all, just focus on one. And the verse is, Shamor et Yom HaShabbat leKadsho. Observe the Sabbath day and keep it holy. You know this commandment. We're doing it right now, observing Shabbat. We heard this verse set to music earlier in the service. Vishamru v'nei Yisrael et ha-Shabbat. The people of Israel shall keep Shabbat. And then we realize, we've heard this commandment before. Earlier, I think, in the book of Exodus, keeping in mind that Moses is retelling what he knows, and he knows those commandments. So we turn back to that verse in Exodus and we read, Zachor et Yom HaShabbat leKadsho. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. And there you have it. Moses repeats the commandment, observe the Sabbath day and keep it holy, different slightly from the original commandment no less than etched in stone. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. So on the surface, it may seem like no big deal. Yet I'd invite you to see this as a really big deal. For some, the idea that there can be more than one version of Torah is disorienting, to say the least. When faced with reconciling these two versions of Torah, one from Exodus and one from Deuteronomy, the rabbis get rather creative in their answers. And one of the more creative ways to reconcile these different versions around the commandment for Shabbat is a song familiar to most everyone. Our cantorial soloist Todd Herzog sang it tonight in the liturgical poem Lecha Dodi, composed by Shlomo Halevi Alkabetz in the 16th century in the mystical city of Safat. The first verse in the song, and this will be familiar, Shamor v'zachor b'dibur echad, translated loosely as, keep and remember a single commandment that the one God caused us to hear. Alkabetz takes these two words, each separately used in a commandment, and then with a little chutzpah, getting inside God's head, asserts that these words were intended by God all along as one single commandment, not two separate commandments. Rabbi Shira Milgram helps put this in perspective in a way I think that reflects and lifts up the brilliance of the biblical authors and the enterprise of biblical interpretation. She boldly writes, were we to imagine that God's truth could be concretized into any form, 2 tablets, a Torah scroll, a dogma, or a text, that would be, she says, idolatry. It would trivialize divinely inspired wisdom and limit God's infinite presence. It pushes back against a singular truth. So I would like to take Rabbi Milgram's thread and connect it to the transition we make from last week to this week. Last week was the third and final haftarah of admonition. The prophets laying the responsibility on the Israelites' unethical, faithless behavior for the destruction of the first and second temples in Jerusalem. The destructions of the temples observed last week in the holiday of Tisha B'Av, the 9th day of Av, is the saddest day in the Jewish calendar, a day of mourning. And this week, we begin what's called the Sheva Denechmata, the 7 haftarot of consolation. Judaism is forever hopeful. When we cannot imagine better days, we see that darkness eventually leads to light. This is the experience of the Jewish people, and I think this is the universal experience for all of humanity. From the destruction of the first temple, the Babylonian exile ends when the Persian king brings back the Jewish people to rebuild the temple. After the second temple is destroyed by the Romans, the great Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is smuggled out of Jerusalem in a coffin only to reform Judaism from the biblical commandments around animal sacrifice to rabbinic Judaism based on what we do today. Tonight, we worship God through prayers and reflect God's Spirit through our deeds, how we treat one another, and how we care for this precious planet Earth entrusted to our care. Judaism is non-dogmatic and thrives on multiple perspectives and interpretation. We have core values that we hold dear, summed up by the rabbis in 2 different pieces of wisdom. Everyone is created in the image of God, and love your neighbor as yourself. The most enduring words of Torah, considered the watchword of our faith, are received this week as Rabbi Steele spotlighted in these words that we can thank Moses for in retelling, giving us these divinely inspired words to the Israelites and to each of us. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. V'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha, b'chol levavcha uv'chol nafshecha uv'chol me'odecha. Lord your God, love your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. And then, v'hayu hadivarim ha'ele asher anochi mitzavcha chayom al levavecha. Take to heart these instructions which I charge you this day. These words of Torah, hadivarim, are placed al levavecha, upon our hearts. And the rabbis remind us in these words that Torah is about real life. The words that lay upon our hearts are only internalized, embodied, when our hearts crack open and words fall into our heart. We let in words of Torah in moments of soaring joy and moments of deep sorrow. Life and truth are not one-dimensional. The gift of Torah is to affirm each of our voices, each of our life experiences, to open our hearts, to admonish us when we need it, when we get off track or miss the mark, as we do throughout our lives, and console us showing there is always a way back, always a return to our best selves. We are channeling it right now. That's what the prophet Isaiah gives us in this week's Haftarah, in his prophetic words, Nachamu, Nachamu Ami. Comfort, O comfort my people. May each of you, wherever you are in your lives, whatever you are carrying, receive these words of comfort.